Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Kei de Mille Volkjeke Limnock. 1000 welcome to Limerick. It's an honor and a pleasure to chair this opening session today of our TNC2002 conference here in sunny Limerick. First of all, on behalf of all of us coming from afar, I would like to thank HEAnet and the University of Limerick to host this year's event and to give us the opportunity to experience firsthand the charm of the Emerald Isle and the proverbial hospitality of its people. Without any delay, I would like to invite our host, Professor Kevin Ryan, VP of Academic at the University of Limerick, to give the welcome address. Professor Ryan, please.
Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure indeed to welcome you here this afternoon. I'm particularly glad to see so many people here, given that there was something of an obstacle course for anyone trying to fly into Ireland at the moment, and you showed exemplary persistence and ingenuity if you managed to get here from abroad with such difficulties. I suppose I could start by saying, well, here are my speaking notes. And I have them written on these little things. There may be people in the room who don't even know what these little things are. I won't embarrass you by asking how many people don't know what they are, but I'll tell you that when I was speaking to a final year computer science class a few years ago, before I became vice president, well, I still am, I suppose, professor of information technology in the university, and have been Dean of the College of Informatics and Electronics. But at the time when I was last lecturing, I asked a final year class of computer science students, what was this? And I held up this and said, what's that? There were 65 in the class, and there were only 4 who knew what it was. The other 61 shook their heads and said no. And they shook their heads even more when I told them what it was. They said, you're not serious. And I said, yes, I am. On the back of this is some of the data from my PhD project. I think what that tells us is that everything changes. And in this business, everything changes much more quickly. It's both a shock and a privilege to be able to see yourself as one of the founders, one of the first people, one of the pioneers of the field you're involved in. It's a privilege because you're able to see so much change so quickly, and you're able to look back at the origins of so much of the technology and the things that we thought impossible 30 years ago that are done as a matter of course by kids at home using small computers without even thinking about it. We thought they were research projects 30 years ago. But of course it's a shock as well, because if it continues to change at this speed, well, we don't know, we have no idea where we're going to be in 10 years' time or 20 years' time. Nobody predicted the outcome. It's another topic that I have been known to speak on, which is so-called futurology. If you read the predictions of the people in the 60s and 70s as to how the world was going to be, you realize just how much has changed and how quickly it's changed. So in my brief welcome to you today, I just want to talk a little bit about change and about continuity, and particularly about the strange interaction between change and continuity, because sometimes we're inclined to talk as if change changed everything. Change somehow or other wipes the board clean and you start all over again, but that's not the way change happens. Change is incremental. Even when it's rapid, it's incremental, and it builds on top of what's there already. And if you haven't built the correct things there already, then the change can't be embedded correctly. And I think this concept of having the correct foundation, having the correct infrastructure, is at the heart of what your conference is about, if I've understood it correctly. But let me talk a little bit first about Ireland, because Ireland has been a fascinating country to live in for the last 30 years. The degree of change in Ireland, the degree of economic, social, cultural change has been phenomenal. in many ways, it's unprecedented, even within a rapidly changing world, even by comparison with the rapidly changing societies elsewhere in the world, such as in Eastern Europe or in the Far East. Ireland has changed out of all recognition. The economic performance of Ireland in the last 10 years has been a shock to, obviously, a lot of observers outside Ireland, but I should hasten to add, it's been a shock to most of the observers inside Ireland too. Not so long ago, less than 10 years ago, you could buy any amount of literature and economic and social commentary on why Ireland was and would continue to be the basket case of Europe, why the Irish economy was stuck in a mire from which it was unable to extract itself. And explanations now as to how we were so successful, and we have been astonishingly successful. We have gone from a situation where we were at 67% of the average European GDP per capita to a situation where we're just above the average European GDP per capita in the space of about 20 years. But most of that growth has been in the last 7 years or 8 years. And the explanations are just as widespread and just as varied now as the explanations that were given as to why we were never going to succeed. So one should be very careful about believing any of this sort of analysis as to why things happened. And that's a caveat for anything I'm going to say from here on. Much has changed socially in Ireland as well. We have gone from being a high unemployment, high emigration country to being an almost full employment economy with significant immigration. And that, of course, has challenged, as the chairman referred to, the legendary hospitality of the Irish. It might have been a lot easier to have legendary hospitality when all you were doing was emigrating and you had a few visitors coming now and again and they were mostly ethnically Irish anyhow. When you start having immigration, then perhaps your legendary hospitality is put to a test that it didn't anticipate. Underlying most of the change in Ireland and much of the economic growth has been the technological impact, and in particular the technological impact of the IT sector. It's an extraordinary fact that last year, the year before, Ireland, in purely monetary terms, was the largest exporter of software in the world. Now, you can ascribe that to many things, and it would be foolish to jump to the conclusion that Ireland was the largest developer of software in the world. But it is a major exporter and a significant developer of software and of IT products. Here in Limerick alone, for example, the Dell Corporation ships something like $10 million US dollars worth of equipment. I think it's per day. What has also changed in Ireland, and one of the major advances, and the one that is welcomed most by university senior academics like myself, is the realization that research is the only way in which we can stay ahead of the posse in this type of business. Ireland is no longer a low-cost, low labour cost, low technology environment. Irish people expect to be paid at least as well as most of their European counterparts, and consequently we can't afford to compete on price simply on labour costs from here on. Therefore we must compete on research and on leading edge technology and on product development and in the quality of what we do. It's gone from worrying about our capacity to our capability, from our ability to produce large quantities to our ability to produce high quality. The development of research has been consequently highly important to the Irish university sector and to the Irish government over the last few years. And the scale of that commitment is quite unprecedented. I'm in the academic business long enough to remember when a grant of, well, the modern equivalent of 5,000 or 10,000 euro would be a cause for celebration in a computer science department. We would all go dancing on a grant of 10,000 euro. And in the current 5-year period, under the current development plan, the government have committed 1.8 billion euro to research. And that is coming through various agencies, coming through the HEA, coming through the Department of Enterprise and Employment, coming particularly through Science Foundation Ireland, which has been established especially to support the biotechnology and the ICT sectors. Now, to deliver that research, we need infrastructure and backbone, and that's where the HEAnet and its nodes and its connectivity to the outside world is going to be crucial. It essentially allows all the Irish researchers to participate in European and international projects, and not just those in science, technology, engineering, ICT. Much of the research that is benefiting from the spreading of connectivity is in the arts, in humanities, in business, in education, in fields that not so long ago would have had nothing to do with the internet. Again, looking back to the days of my cards, I can actually remember the day I first saw an email message. And I know exactly where it was, and I know where I was standing, you know, when the fellow said to me, "This is a message we got from somebody in America." And I said, "How did that come?" "Oh, it came through email." And I said, "What's email?" Naturally, there were Unix hackers, and naturally it was in the maths department. You know, it wasn't in a computer science department. Those were the days. Some of you will remember that the maths departments adopted Unix ahead of many of the computer science departments. That was in late 1960s, let's say. Now we have people lecturing in history for whom connectivity to the internet is crucial to their research, and that's a complete change. People in literature and business and management. In particular areas of research, Ireland has tried to take a lead. Partly this is an economically driven phenomenon where the companies that have invested in Ireland have been particularly in the telecoms area, in areas like middleware and security software, in back office systems, in call centres and in educational software. These are all areas which Ireland has been particularly successful in. But continuity and the ability to keep doing those things, the ability to keep ahead of the pack, will depend on significant high quality research in the universities and in industry. And that for Ireland is really the only way to go. We have really no choice. If we don't move up the value chain, then we're out, and we know that. Now, just to say a little bit about our university here. First of all, of course, we're really glad you decided to have your conference here in Limerick and at this university. I'm glad especially that you're here in spite of the air traffic problems. I'm glad you're here this week and not 2 weeks ago when we had, according to the paper I was reading this morning, we had the wettest May on record, and if you consider that the first 2 weeks of May were dry, it didn't rain at all, you can just imagine what the last 2 weeks of May were like. Essentially, they were sodden. And I confess I spent one of those weeks in Florida, which was a good choice. The University of Limerick has been one of the key contributors to the development of the Irish economic miracle. Now, it isn't that we did it all on our own. That would be gross exaggeration. But it's far more that the University of Limerick and the other universities and the regional technical colleges, which are now institutes of technology, and the investment in infrastructure, particularly telecommunications infrastructure, all provided the raw material that allowed for the rapid economic growth that took place. But this university did make some unique contributions. In particular, we have one of the largest cooperative education programs in Europe. We place over 2,000 undergraduate students in industrial placement every year. That's a very significant number. We have a modular credit system. We've put an emphasis on IT from a very early stage. The student accommodation, which I'm sure many of you are staying in, I think many of you are staying in the Drumroe village. Now, I have to say that's the luxury student accommodation. There's some less luxury student accommodation, but all of it from the very beginning was wired for internet access. And that was a far-sighted decision, as was the decision to choose electronics as one of our key subject areas in 1973, when most universities thought electronics was one of those passing things that those engineers were getting up to, and it would never amount to much. Our current change for this university is an increased emphasis on research. We have made our name on the quality of our graduates, and that's a good thing. But we also need to make our name on the quality of our research. We will seek our share of all the funding that's coming from the government, and that's being allocated on a competitive basis. We have many different projects, and I could talk at length about some of the research projects, but I'll just mention a couple because I think they're particularly unusual or interesting, at least I think so. We have a considerable amount of research on how people interact with computer systems, and some of the projects are particularly fascinating. Just during the week, I had the pleasure of seeing one project which involves the storage of sound in boxes. And the idea being that children can manipulate sound physically. So a sound is put in a box, and when the box is put in another box, when you open that box, the sound plays. When you close it, the sound stops. When you move the box, the pitch changes. When you move it in another direction, the volume changes. And when you combine the boxes together and open their lids, you get all sorts of different sounds. It sounds completely crazy. Let me just say that on Wednesday I had the privilege of showing Michael Dell around the campus here, because he was here for the award of an honorary doctorate, and that this fascinated him sufficiently to get him off his schedule. And indeed, he had his children with him, but not on the tour. He was tempted to bring his kids back and let them play with this for the rest of the day, and then they wouldn't have been sitting here in the front row getting restless while I was reading this lengthy and no doubt worthy citation to Michael Dell, but that his kids were sitting there going, "Ma, do we have to listen to any more of this?" That's really fascinating type of work, very innovative. Another area, much more industrially oriented, is in the onboard computing in the future generation automobiles. A number of our people here are working on the definition and development of the standards for CAN bus and for the onboard computing, and the not so far away time when we will have drive-by-wire as we have fly-by-wire in the aircraft. Some of us who are interested in the area of software quality will hope that we won't have it before we've figured out how to make reliable real-time software. We have many links with the outside world, and again, we depend on the network for that. Many of these projects, obviously projects like that, which that one involves Bosch and various other European companies and European universities. We have many links with universities like Maryland, Penn State, Boston, Twente, Cranfield, Aarhus, Linköping, so on. There are many universities that we have links with externally, and many links with companies, IBM, Allied Irish Banks. We have a strong link with the Nokia Corporation, where we work in the area of quality, particularly quality in manufacturing. And we have links with Dell, and we've done a lot of work on supply chain management, which most of you will know is Dell's key competitive advantage. It's the reason they're the best they are. And indeed, it's one of the reasons Nokia wanted to be linked with us, was so that they could have a link with Dell. And we are acting in some form or other as midwives in fostering a relationship between these two giants of industry. Of course, we're not doing it entirely altruistically. We expect to benefit from being the midwives. So the University of Limerick is very involved in both the industrial, academic, research and social development of Ireland. We want to continue to do that. We want to continue to build it, and we need the infrastructure to do that. And your conference, the HEAnet conference, is part of our involvement with this great European movement. The University of Limerick has benefited enormously from involvement in the European movement, in the European Union. Part of these early buildings were funded by the European Union. We're very pleased to have you here. We welcome you very much. We welcome the people from HEAnet. I particularly want to thank my colleague Gordon Young, who chairs HEAnet and who is, I think, instrumental in bringing the conference here, along with John. And I would like to say we have a history of having large conferences here. It's just 2 years ago, almost to the day, that we opened the International Conference on Software Engineering here in this hall, where we had over 900 people from all over the world in the software engineering field. So essentially, the message I want to leave you with is that Ireland's future, Ireland's progress, is connected with research, is dependent on research. Research is dependent on infrastructure. So I don't want to put weight on your shoulders, but, you know, it's all riding on you. We depend on you for the infrastructure. We need the infrastructure for the research, and we need the research for our development. So I just end by wishing you success in the traditional Irish way, which is to say, Gunnairi an bóthar leat, and translated that means basically, may the road rise with you, or may the road rise to meet you. It's a traditional wish of success. I hope your conference is successful. Gunnairi an bóthar leat. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ryan. I think all of us who have the pleasure to visit Ireland cannot but see the difference and the evolution Ireland has seen over the last 10 years. Professor Ryan mentioned the economic growth, the full employment, the impact of IT, I think credit goes to the institutions like the University of Limerick and also to Professor Ryan himself, who has seen this institution grow within one generation to now 11,000 students. As Professor Ryan said, progress depends on research depends on infrastructure, and nobody symbolizes that progress of infrastructure more than John Boland of HEAnet. I have seen him being a little bit behind in the second peloton of the Tour du RNE, and over the last 5 years, he pedaled his way up to the lead group in the RNE pelotons of Europe. John, please.
Well, Gurmagat Yves. Well, Coordicus, Taimonasasta, Galer, Gur Arig Liv Galer, Galimnuk, Vaintamach, Slán agus Sawalia. You're very welcome. I was congratulating you for getting into Limerick in spite of everything safe and sound. We've been, with the Terraina staff, with our own staff and with Limerick, we've been planning this conference and working on it for about 2 years. And we've put a lot of effort in to get the attention to detail right. But we couldn't have foreseen in the post-September 11th airline situation that our own national airline would have a row with their pilots and decide to try and commit hara-kiri. And so in spite of that, you've all got here, so well done. I'm going to just talk for about 10 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit the history of Irish networking. I considered giving a sort of 2-hour in-depth analysis of all the links and connections around the country, but I decided to forego that and take you on the scenic route maybe and take a quicker trip through time. Just talk a little bit about the current infrastructure and finally the facilities here in the university. So just going to go back a little bit in time. Although HEAnet has only been around for 20 years, and we've been, as Yves said, we were a bit behind in the whole European networking thing. We've been working hard to catch up in the last few years. But in fact, Irish research goes back a bit longer in terms of collaborating with Europeans. And there was a period around the 700s, which was regarded as the golden age, when Ireland was the island of saints and scholars. In post-Roman Europe, Christianity came to Ireland, and Irish missionaries and monks and people who had set up abbeys and monasteries and centres of learning started to go abroad and to exchange information, come back and so on. A lot of copying of manuscripts and copying of documents and so on went on. So just talk a little bit about that. There's St. Brendan the Voyager, who is legendary voyages to the Scottish Isles and around Europe. So these people were called the Irish Peregrini. Some of you will know better than me what that means. One of I've looked for evidence of where evidence exists today of what's happened, and St. Paul was one of the first people. A lot of activity in Brittany, hence the Celtic relationship with Ireland. St. Paul went further afield to Burgundy. Then St. Columkill, around 563, went towards the Scottish Isles, towards the islands of Iona, and set up the monastery there. And there is dispute as to whether that is where the Book of Kells actually was written, but certainly a lot of important manuscripts were produced there. St. Columban, who founded, I guess, the Knights of St. Columbanus nowadays, went to Luxeuil and on to Bobbio in Italy. St. Bede went to Lindisfarne, or he came to Ireland, or there was a lot of toing and froing. And St. Gall set up in St. Gallen, which is today one of there's a lot of evidence, there's a monastery there, and indeed to Holland as well. So a lot of travels way back then in those times. But I'm going to, after that quick tour, going to bring it bang up to the minute. And as Kevin was alluding there, In the last number of years, the information age has been very important to Ireland, and the government have put a lot of effort and support into that. And if I quote from in 2000, they set up an Information Society Commission, and the last sentence of the report says that achieving success as an information society cannot be viewed as an optional extra for Ireland. Rather, it's the foundation of future competitiveness, wealth creation, and an inclusive society. And we heard Kevin talk about specific examples of all that based in the university. Allied with that vision, the government put in place a national development plan, a 6-year plan. They had an aggressive program of deregulation, introducing competition in line with the EC guidelines. In the current government, which will be formed this Thursday, it is believed, there will be a Minister for e-government and e-activities appointed. There is funding to provide broadband infrastructure in effectively every town in the country, planned over the next 4 years. And as Kevin alluded to much more eloquently, that there is unprecedented funding in research activities. And on foot of all this, HEAnet has gotten funding to connect to Internet 2 and to HEAnet and to the worldwide research community. Terrain and HEAnet are critically important to us. There's certainly evidence in the country that education and research underpins our future economic growth. And so collaboration and sharing experience with the other national networks, with our colleagues from the US, from Canada, and worldwide, is very important to the development of our network and our people here. And by being connected to HEAnet and Internet 2, we are connected to some 3,000 institutions, and seamlessly the researchers and academics and students can collaborate across the world. And for an island nation stuck out in the North Atlantic with lousy weather, that's important, you know. So, and indeed, we can contribute through these activities to EC-funded research activity. Just to look then just at our own national infrastructure for a moment. We have a national backbone. Now you know where Limerick is. You can see where we are there. We have nodes in Cork, Galway, Dublin, and Limerick, and then we have a neutral exchange connections and some gigabit connections to the City West, which is where most of the international carriers set up. Again, one of the government initiatives to create a critical mass of international infrastructure. Under the National Development Plan funding, we have gotten funding to connect to the research communities, and this means to Internet 2, to Canary, to Startap, and so on. We've replaced our 10155 with connections to the HEAnet network in Northern Ireland, seamless connectivity north and south, and we're working on backup facilities on the island for HEAnet and for HEAnet. And then, very importantly, our links to HEAnet. We have dual links at the moment, and we're currently out to tender for taking these into the gigabit range, which would be the first live production gigabit link out of the country. So, just to finish off, just to talk a little bit about the facilities in the University of Limerick. As you can see, they're a point of presence on our network, so they should be pretty well connected. There's a wireless network been set up here in the foundation building, in the atrium area. We've got some 50 cards provided by Cisco, which can be availed of from our HEAnet stand. If you go there and sign for them, people can borrow cards to put in their laptops. On the library ground floor, there's a computer room, and there is a laptop plug-in area for some 25 machines. The drummer residences are on net, as I'm sure most of you who are there have found out already. And, of course, the conference sessions will be streamed live. So my children back in Dublin are watching me speak right now, I think. And the good news is that all the World Cup matches will be on national television here, so there's no pay-per-TV or anything like that. Okay. So, looking forward to a successful and enjoyable conference, and Gurmagav Galer.
Thank you very much, John. Now, John reminded me that in Flanders we were still barbarians, where you were already converted, and in fact Willy Brothers came to my home village in those days to say hello. But to come back to the present day, I think you are now in that front peloton, but the race is not over, and I think there's another 100 miles to go. And really I see, when I put on my hat as a member of the Canary Policy Board, of course, as Canary, to look at the Canadian interests, we look what happens in the world, and I think we'll have to watch Ireland more and more, because you will be in the gigabit range, in the select gigabit club very soon. Thank you very much, John. Now, since we last met in Antalya, our R&E community has seen unprecedented growth, going from megabit to gigabits. For the first time ever, our most bandwidth-hungry scientists have the capacity they need for their most ambitious projects. I'm thinking, for example, Harvey Newman of Caltech, who really wants to eat all the bandwidth available. And now with the bandwidth issues out of the way, we can give more attention to the application set. And I think François Fluckiger, who comes from CERN is really à la fine pointe of research. We all know that François was in charge of external networks there for about 15 years, and on his network, some things were born like World Wide Web and hypertext and things like that. And the progress continues. And I think the motto which François chose for this year, Network for Collaboration, is really fitting, because at this point in time, I think we start a new chapter in our quest for a seamless and borderless world for the advancement of knowledge. And in fact, here at the University of Limerick is the ideal setting to talk about this, because I don't know if you noticed, but at the entrance of the main building, there's a big stone with University of Limerick written on one side, and on the other side it's written, "And plucked till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun." François.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the program committee, it's a pleasure for me to briefly present what you are going to hear and to see over the four coming days. Every conference needs a theme, and when we asked the members of the program committee for topics for Limerick, we ended up with a variety of ideas: middleware, peer-to-peer, multimedia, distributed processing, distributed data access, grid technologies. And it became clear that there was a common denominator to these topics, and it was collaboration, networking for collaboration between human beings, between computer systems, between humans and systems. So networking for collaboration, this is the theme of this year's conference. Now, consistently with the theme, we would like this year to increase interactivity between you, between the speakers and you, and between the organizers and you. So to this end, we will have both sessions, are often. There are a few already scheduled. We will have also something which is new this year, the possibility for you to meet some of our speakers for an informal discussion during lunches. So there will be meet with the speaker tables, which will be reserved and identified with table 10s, where you can join some of the speakers for lunch, and this will operate on a first come, first seated basis. So if there are stars you want to meet, take the necessary measures. This may be a recipe for chaos, but we count on your help to make it a success, and if not, we count on your indulgence, because we are experimenting this idea. We may also have, in addition to these lunch sessions, also evening sessions to meet with the speaker between 8 and 8:30. The schedule will be announced on Tuesday. Now, something new also this year, live in Limerick. Live in Limerick is your site, your website for up-to-date conference information and news, today's presentations, today's events and meetings, social events, and also even more essential information such as the opening time for the bar and many more. So you may also send your photo if you wish. You may compete for the Limerick contest. You may know everything about the World Cup. So even the coming Wednesday during the, Ireland against Germany match, please stay with us because you will get the score at least at the end of the session. And you may also get confirmation that it is still raining or not. This is what the site looks like if it works. Yes, it works. So you can see the weather today here. Okay. Well, 12 years ago, some of us were already in Ireland, in HEAnet, for the conference of HEAnet, the predecessor of the arena. Who was in HEAnet in June 1990? Well, not that many people. Now, in HEAnet, Michael Walsh, the organizer, opened the conference. Is Michael around? Michael is not around. And Michael said, everything is working fine so far, except the weather. Yes, because we have very heavy rain. And he said, everything is working fine except the weather, but don't worry, we are working on it. And eventually they fixed it. So this year I would say everything is fine so far except the strike. But don't worry, we are working on it. If you have contribution to send, photos, comments, you can send all your input to carol@terena.nl or even visit the Terena office, which is in this building on the first floor. This site was created and maintained by Patricia Soria de Miguel, so we should thank her because this is really the first time we do have such a site, and we believe it will be a good tool for communication. A couple of announcements. Like as was said on the program, initial program, the opening barbecue dinner tonight is at 7:30 and not 7. As usual, we ask you to turn your mobile phone, to turn it off. And a third announcement that was just given just before this session, wireless LAN cards for your laptops, wireless LAN cards are available at the HEAnet stand just outside this room. So if you need to have modern communication wireless with your laptop, you can go there, sign a book, and borrow a wireless LAN card. We also ask you to try and fill out the evaluation forms throughout the conference, and we appreciate your comment. Now, of course, due to the strike, some speakers cannot do it. Others may not show up in last minute. So some sessions will have to be shortened. Others may have more time for questions. We'll do our best. We will take any contingency measure whenever possible, but we thank you in advance for your indulgence. This brings me back to the content and to conclude this introduction. Well, I think that over the past 2 decades, network services was about sharing. In the 80s, it was about sharing of files, computers, mail. In the 90s, it was about sharing of information using the web. The coming decade will probably propel us into a new dimension where processing power, complex applications, and probably any type of computer-based resources may be shared seamlessly using probably grid technologies. And what is remarkable is that all those services were, and still are designed by and for the research community. And they expand, as we know, far beyond academic circles, and they permeate all levels of the society. So I think we can be reasonably proud of what we are doing. Okay, so many thanks to the program committee and the Terina staff for this great program, and enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, François. So we all will know the opening times of the pubs, the time the game between Ireland and Germany start, and me personally, I will look tomorrow at the Belgium-Japan game. This being said, it's a great pleasure today to have Professor Lawrence Lessig here from Stanford, who is a constitutional law and cyberspace expert. I have always wondered, and maybe he will share that with us today, why he decided to become a cyberspace expert. My theory is he thought in cyberspace he would have peace and quiet from his day-to-day activities, fled to cyberspace, and all the legal issues decided to follow him there. In his recent book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, Larry addresses some pressing and seemingly contradictory issues which we have lived and heard about a lot in recent times, like free speech, copyright law, privacy, and how to make these things compatible. They are hard to reconcile. I'm sure they will continue to be a source of debate for a long time to come, but I look forward to hear Larry. Professor Lessig, please.
Thank you very much. I apologize we got started late because I was asked to prepare a lecture of a certain length. I hate people who talk over breaks, and so now I'm going to have a very good reason to hate myself very soon because the allotted time is longer than the time necessary to the break. But let me start with this. I have 4 stories to introduce an argument about where the Internet has been and where it's going. It's a story, an argument, about how the space for innovation and creativity that you built is being undermined and destroyed by the sort of work that people I produce for a living is doing, work that lawyers are doing in changing the character of the Internet. 4 stories. It's an extraordinary fact, a testament to the blindness of lawyers and perhaps economists, that until midway through the last century, law and economics assumed they were totally separate spheres. Law assumed it had no connection to what economics was doing. Economics had no real interest in what law did. This came to an end in the United States in the early 1950s, when a class on antitrust law taught by the dean of the University of Chicago Law School, Edward Levy, had a visitor, an economist from the University of Chicago. This economist, Aaron Director, asked to sit in on Levy's class. Levy allowed him, and there began a pattern for 4 days a week. Levy would teach the law of antitrust, and on the 5th day, Director would stand up and teach a class about why everything Levy had said was wrong. And therein was born this discipline called law and economics, where law understood how its activities affected economics and how it needed to understand economics to know how it could achieve the regulatory ends that it purported to seek. That's the first story. The second story I'm sure most of you are familiar with. There's a man named Paul Baran who in 1964 came up with a technology for networking which is similar to what we would think of as packet switching. I don't want to get into the debate about whether he was first. He was the first at the Rand Institute to come up with this idea, and they presented this idea to the Defense Department, who loved this technology for facilitating redundant communication technology. The Defense Department took this technology and wanted it implemented, so they took it to the dominant network provider in the United States, at the time a company called AT&T, and they said, "We want you to help us implement this technology." And AT&T said, "First, this technology will never possibly work. And second, if it does work, we'll be damned if we allow the creation of a competitor to ourselves." Baran, seeing the writing on the wall, not with PowerPoint, but seeing it in conceptual sense, that there was no possibility of this technology succeeding at the time, backed off. And packet switch technology would take another decade to come alive. Story 3. You know these people. These are the Brothers Grimm. They wrote fairy tales. You probably think these are nice fairy tales told by the Brothers Grimm. You think they're pretty stories of wondrous enlightenment that you should teach your children. I urge you, if you've never read the Grimm's fairy tales, to keep your children far from these works. These are awful, bloody, moralistic stories, which are not the sort of thing that any child should be raised upon unless the child lives in the 18th century Germany. These stories are meaningful and colorful to us because they've been retold to us. Retold by the Disney Corporation, retold because these stories lived in the public domain at the time the Disney Corporation or Walt Disney decided he wanted to retell these stories. They lived in a Creative Commons, available to anyone to take and use as they wished. And they lived here because copyright in the United States and around the world is for a limited time, meaning this creativity lives in a space where it can be drawn upon and used without the permission of a lawyer. The commons, the public domain, is a lawyer-free zone. That's a great thing. It's a wondrously powerful opportunity for creativity, which is guaranteed by this constitutional requirement in the United States that terms are limited. These limited terms in the United States were originally very short, 14 years. If the author lived, it could be extended to 28 years. Then it was extended to 42 years, then extended to 56 years, then extended to 61. Look, Ma, no hands. Repeatedly, 11 times in the last 40 years, in fact, the United States Congress has extended the term of existing copyrights so that they now live for 95 years for corporate works. The latest extension in 1998 is a statute called the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. Those of us who love it refer to it as the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. Every time Mickey is about to pass into the public domain, bingo, a new extension of copyright. This extension of copyright has meant that no work falls into the public domain anymore, which means that no one can do to Disney what Disney did to the Brothers Grimm. Sorry. Fourth story. This cute little puppy is called the Aibo dog. It's a production of the Sony Corporation. This Aibo dog is available to be purchased for an extraordinary amount of money, $1,500 or something like this. And you can teach this dog how to behave, how to dance, how to move, how to react to your input. This dog captures the imagination of many, including someone who set up a site called ibopet.com. On ibopet.com, there were hacks available for the Aibo dog. And one of these hacks would enable you to teach your Aibo jazz. Your dog could dance jazz. Now, let's be clear. It's not a crime to dance jazz in most jurisdictions in the United States. It's not a crime to program an animal to dance jazz. It's not a crime except if in the context of the programming you must do something called circumvent a copy protection system. And that's in fact what was necessary to hack the Aibo pet to dance jazz. And so when ibopet.com posted this hack, they received a letter from the Sony Corporation. Your site contains information providing the means to circumvent IBOWare's copy protection protocol, constituting a violation of the anti-circumvention provisions of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It's a crime to teach your dog to dance jazz in the United States under the current reigning ideology of protection that says you have no power to tinker with a technology you have purchased, even when the tinkering does not facilitate in any sense the theft of anyone's property. Those are the stories. Here's the argument. 4 quick steps. The first one, echoing the first point about the interaction between technology, between law and economics, is the interaction between technology and law. Code, the architecture of cyberspace, the framing of this existence, this space, the permissions that get built into the software here. Code is law. Just as law had to understand economics, the argument is code must understand law, and more importantly, coders must understand law. This same move that happened 50 years ago at the University of Chicago has to happen in technology space now. Because the values and the permissions of a system of freedom built by the Internet is embedded in this technology, and this freedom is affected by the law. Point 1. Point 2. At the core of what made that original Internet extraordinary was a particular technology, a particular architecture, an architecture that Salzer, Clark, and Reed called end-to-end. The code of the original, in the sense of when it took off, net was end-to-end. That code was the law of that network. That law of the network produced a certain kind of innovation. That innovation produced a certain kind of commons. This is point 3. The commons was a space where innovators were free to build on top of this network without the permission of anyone else. This network, built by end-to-end design, facilitated this commons, and innovation commons. And that innovation commons is being taken away right now by changes implemented in law. A space for innovation and creativity architected through the technology of code that you built is being removed as it gets re-architected through rules that we require, we lawyers require, while you do nothing in response. End-to-end is your architecture. It's what facilitated this network's growth. It is a policy. It is a choice about a certain set of values, about how innovation develops in this space. It is distinct from the choice from earlier architectural designs. Paul Baran confronted a network like this. Users pleaded to the network owner, "Oh, please, network owner, here's an innovation I'd like to lay onto your network." And the network owner chose which innovations the users would get. Innovation was concentrated in this design in the hands of the network owner. What was allowed was what the network owner said. End-to-end has a different architectural philosophy. Its architectural philosophy is the network is built such that no network owner has the power to decide which innovation is allowed. The essence is a network where decisions about what's allowed are vested in the edge or the ends of the network, and the consequence for innovation is that innovation is limited only by the number of people connected to the network. The contrast between the AT&T and end-to-end network is a contrast between the number of potential innovators for that network. End-to-end is limited by nothing more than the number of connections. The AT&T network, or every network which centralizes the power to innovate in the network owner, is limited by the imagination and, more importantly, the business model of the network owner. This consequence of end-to-end producing an innovation commons is just a function of its design, its code, its architecture, what you built. And that architecture therefore constructed a neutral platform for innovation, a platform where equal access to the rights to innovate produced a certain pattern of innovation, a pattern which United States contributors often miss. What were the innovations, the most dramatic innovations of the early network, and where did they come from? Kahn and Cerf began the work in a protocols building TCP/IP. These were kids, graduate students. The World Wide Web gets constructed in Europe here at CERN, built by the Swiss. ICQ, the first peer-to-peer messaging technology, gets constructed in Israel by a kid whose father then takes it and turns it into a $400 million company that AOL acquires. Hotmail is developed by an Indian immigrant in the United States. These technologies, these extraordinary initial innovations that made this network take off, are built by kids and non-Americans. This is not an accident. This is the very essence of what an end-to-end network does. It means outsiders have the equal right to innovate for this network as insiders. It means that network owners have no comparative or absolute power to control, meaning which innovations get developed are the ones that work as outsiders and innovators unconnected to the network to develop it, not the network owners. Anyone connected to this network, and this is because of the end-to-end design. This part should be familiar, but I wanted to express it in policy terms because it's your bias to believe you don't do policy. Policy is the sort of stuff that people who couldn't take advanced calculus do, people like us. Policy is the sort of stuff that lawyers and politicians do, but the fact is, you, like the lawyers in the 1950s, have to recognize that your work is the most important policy making there is right now. And your work, whether with knowledge or not, produced an architecture that had a policy that inspired an extraordinary range of creativity, innovation, and competition. And that's what excited a counter-revolution. For the story of the past 5 years is changes to this fundamental environment for innovation. Changes that are occurring at both a technical level and in a legal context within which this innovation occurs. If I can simplify a network design, not with 7 layers or 11 layers or even Tim Berners-Lee 4 layers, let's just talk about 3 layers. I'm a lawyer, you have to bear with me here. 3 layers of a network: a physical layer, a logical or code layer, and a content layer. The changes that we are seeing are changes, first of all, from the physical layer corrupting the code layer, and changes from the content layer corrupting the code layer, such that this corrupting of the core is producing a network fundamentally different from the network which you gave us. This is occurring because of an awful way in which this debate is now being framed. It's a debate in policy circles by lawyers and politicians that has a familiar rhetoric to it, particularly dangerous in the American context. First framing rhetoric is, it's their property. The corruption that's going on from the physical layer to the core code layer of this network is happening as the internet gets layered onto broadband networks, in particular cable networks in the United States. This corruption happens because as the network gets layered onto these cable networks, the cable networks architect technologies onto this network that revest control into the network owner's hands. This revesting of control follows from the mentality of cable owners. Cable owners are people who believe it's my wire, I can do whatever the hell I want to do with it, and if Cisco or someone teaches me how to policy route technology in my service, then I'll be damned if I don't adopt that policy technology. I will build on top of my network the capability to pick and choose the kinds of content and applications that my network will run, and when that power is allowed, this fundamental feature of end-to-end is compromised. For the power to decide how the network develops is no longer vested exclusively in the edge or the end of the network. Increasingly, it's interfered with by those who stand in the middle of the network owners. Now, this is allowed because the rhetoric in the United States is it's their property. The cable owners built the cables. They therefore get to do with these cables whatever they like. It's framed in a way such that if you question the cable owner's right, it must be because you question property. If you question the cable owner's right, it must be because you're a communist. Who else questions property, especially in the United States? So if you question the power of cable owners to architect the network in a way that fundamentally undermines end-to-end values, it's only because you don't understand the fundamental political value in the United States, which is property. Now, this is a completely historically absurd way to frame the debate. The internet in the United States took off on top of telephone wires just at the time that the telephone company had lost its great favor as the dominant monopoly in the United States. 1984, the telephone monopoly is broken up. After it's broken up, it's regulated so that the owners of the wires have no power to say how their wires will be used. It's architected to be a neutral platform, and because it was regulated to be neutral, the internet could be layered on top of it without any interference by the physical layer's owners. This regulation produced the neutral platform that gave birth to the original internet. But the idea that this new platform, cable layer, should be regulated is now thought to be absolutely outside of possible political thought in the United States. The result is a network that puts policymaking back into the core of the network. So that when the head of AT&T's Internet Services, when AT&T had a head of Internet Services, was asked whether AT&T would permit the streaming of video to computers. After all, AT&T cable permits lots of streaming of video to television sets. What about to computers? The head of Internet Services said, we didn't spend $56 billion on a cable network to, quote, have the blood sucked from our vein, end quote. This is your father's AT&T. This is a company that believes its rights over the property means a right over innovation on the property, means a right to choose how innovation will develop. This is a consequence of this extremely poorly framed debate, which makes it sound like these issues are just an issue about who owns what property. Now, the same debate is occurring in the context of spectrum. And if we had another 2 hours, I'd love more than anything to devote it to understanding how this confusion about property is leading to an architecture of spectrum which will undermine its great opportunity as a resource for innovation, but it's the same debate. The choice is framed in the United States between those who favor regulation of spectrum and those who favor property ownership of spectrum, as if these are the only two options. But as ultra-wideband and spread spectrum technologies make clear, spectrum existing in a kind of commons as a third option, and probably the most technically powerful option for how to allocate access to this resource. That's the first framing debate. It's my property, therefore I get to architect the network however I want, even if the consequence is to corrupt the end-to-end value. The second framing debate is the one that's captured by this absurdly extreme debate going on about copyright regulation in the United States right now. And this debate is framed with the rhetoric, it's just theft. That what's going on is just technology companies getting rich off of theft by kids of other people's content. And so the choice you must make, and if Jack Valenti were here, he'd, in a preacher-like way, lecture you about the morals at stake in this debate are fundamentally the morals about theft and God. Well, he wouldn't say God, but he'd say mean God. He'd be talking about the fact that we're producing a generation that does nothing more than steal. That's the issue as it's framed in Washington. And therefore, if the question is, are you for theft or against it? Obviously, we're against it. And if we're obviously against it, then we're allowed to launch a new war on this theft, as Valenti calls it, a, quote, terrorist war on theft, where the terrorists now are our own children. That's the character of the debate in the United States right now. Now, this debate's got to be put in context to see the mistake in this framing. Because the history of copyright law has been a history of new technologies fundamentally altering the way in which content gets distributed. This is not the first time this problem has hit us. But it is the first time that law has been used to stop the technology rather than to re-strike a balance with copyrights regulation. There used to be a technology where musicians made money through the sale of something called sheet music. Then along came the piano roll and Napsterized the sheet music business. You bought one copy of sheet music, you made it into a piano roll, you sold the piano rolls, and you never paid the musician a dime. This was called, quote, theft. It went to the United States Supreme Court in a claim of stopping the theft, and the Supreme Court said no, it wasn't a copyright violation. And Congress had to come in later and strike a new balance between the copyright owner's interest and the interest in technology, and they did this with a compulsory license that said, you have the right to get access to this content so long as you pay a certain flat fee. But by guaranteeing a right to access, the new technology could take off without the last generation's content owners controlling this new technology. Then there was a technology called broadcast television, which was Napsterized by cable TV. This is a grotesque example of Napsterization, right? Cable television companies set up a technology to capture somebody else's broadcast. They sell it to their customers. Napster never sold anything to anybody, right? But they sold content to their customers. Twice the Supreme Court was asked to stop this theft. Twice the Supreme Court said, tough, not a copyright violation. Not our problem. Not our problem. You have to go to Congress, and 20 years after this, quote, theft started, Congress finally got around to striking a new balance between copyright owners and technologists, and the balance was the same as the balance struck with sheet music, a compulsory license. So that content owners would be paid, but that broadcasters couldn't leverage their control over that content into control over the cable television industry. Compensation was to be separated from control. And so the cable television industry could become its own monopoly without the help of broadcasters. Then there was a thing called American film, which would be Napsterized by the VCR technology, which Jack Valenti called the Boston Strangler of the American film industry. Worse, it was a Japanese Boston Strangler of the American film industry. The same year that Congress struck the balance with the Cable Television Act, the VCR was attacked in a federal court when Disney and Universal claimed this Napsterization, to anachronize a bit, had to stop. 8 years later, the Supreme Court said, tough. The Supreme Court said, our question, when faced with a new technology that facilitates a different way of distributing content, is not whether there are some uses that are illegal, or not whether on balance there are more uses that are legal than uses that are illegal. Our question is just whether there's any potential for substantial, non-infringing use of this technology. Now, let's just be clear about what that means. The Supreme Court said there were lots of uses of this technology, the Boston Strangler of the American film industry, that would be illegal uses. You could commit copyright violations with this technology, no doubt. You could commit murder with it if you hit somebody on the head with it, no doubt. There were illegal uses of this technology. But the court said, I don't care about the illegal uses. I care only whether there's a potential for a substantial non-infringing use. And they found two. And based on those two, the Supreme Court said, it's not our problem anymore. Congress has to restrike the balance, because when there's a change in technology affecting the distribution of content, it's no longer a judicial matter. Now, that tradition of balance in the face of new technologies has been revoked in the United States right now. Right now, what happens when a new technology is presented that affects how content is distributed, that technology must defend itself in a federal court. The most recent example is a technology called Replay TV. Replay TV is a technology which is the updated version of the VCR. It's a digital video recorder. This digital video recorder is in all respects analogous to the VCR, and so one would think the issue had been decided in the Sony case. But when the company defending the Replay TV told the court, there's this case called the Sony case, the court said, well, we need a trial to figure out whether the technology should be allowed here. A trial, which means multiple-year process with millions of dollars spent on experts who will hypothesize about whether the market on balance will be in favor of the copyright industry or against it. Many years later, this federal judge, this kind of Soviet planner, but with better computers perhaps, will sit there and decide whether this new innovation will be allowed. A judge will decide whether this new innovation will be allowed. And what this reality has meant is that venture capitalists in the United States now know that there's no reason to invest money in new technologies to deliver content unless it has the approval of the RIAA or the MPAA or any interest group that is likely to litigate against this technology, which means the future of content production and distribution is as the last generation industries say. They get to veto new ways of delivering content, just like the architecture of broadband cable gets to veto new kinds of innovations and content which they don't approve of. This, too, is a corruption of an end-to-end value which originally had been protected by a tradition in American law. Now, the extremes of this are quite outrageous. In the Napster case, when the Napster company said to a federal judge, okay, we have a technology to guarantee 98% of the trades made on our service will comply with copyright law. 98%. The judge said 98% isn't good enough. Go back and make it 100%. Now, if that were the standard that the Xerox machine had to live under, would we ever have had copy machines? If that were the standard that governed handguns, I mean, just think about handguns in the United States, right? Here's a technology usable for good uses and bad uses, or at least they tell me there are good uses. I'm not sure what they are, but assume there are good uses. Just because there are bad uses, though, it doesn't mean you ban the technology, because we have some good uses. But what if you had to say 98% of the uses had to be good uses? Would you have handguns in the United States? Now, if this got us handgun control in the United States, I might be in favor of this standard of liability. But the reality is we have a perverse system of zero tolerance for copyright violations and lots of tolerance for violations of law that result in death. The one thing I know is that no circumvention technology has ever killed anybody yet in the United States. 100% of circumvention technologies are banned, but lots of technologies for violating the law are not. And then the latest extreme of this is a bill proposed by Senator Fritz Hollings from the great state of South Carolina, who would mandate that technology guarantee, if it can transmit content, that no transmission occurs unless of copyrighted content without the copyright owner's control, which means that machines would have to be built, as Craig Barrett of Intel said. The police state would be put in every machine to be able to identify legitimate transfers from illegitimate transfers. All of this re-architecting of the Internet context in order to make sure that last century's businesses have the ability to continue in the same way they did business last century in the future. This is because it's framed in a debate about theft. This is only theft at stake here. It's framed in a way that makes it just about law, as if technology has no role here. It's framed in a way that makes these three domains that we see interact, law, technology, and economics, in the context of the Internet, end-to-end, producing competition, which produced a certain kind of freedom in the context of creativity and innovation, being reframed in this policy debate as a debate just about law, these other dimensions of technology and economics rendered invisible. Dinosaurs, then, have the power to control what evolution in this space looks like. They choose the innovation which will be allowed because they have the power through law, through this construction called copyright, to choose that future because policymakers have forgotten the history of this in the past. Now, what do we do about this? There's this bizarre, simple way in which internet technologies has been understood by policymakers. The only thing they've understood is the concept of binary, 1 and 0. And so this debate is framed in a binary way. It's either you're for property or against it. It's either you're for theft or you're against it. There's no such thing as space between these two extremes, but this is exactly what we need to rediscover, a balance in these two extremes. We live in real space with private homes and public roads. These things go together. We have backyards and city parks. These things work together to facilitate innovation. There's space that's controlled, private property. There's space held in common. And these things produce innovation together. A world governed just by the commons would be a world without innovation. See the Soviet Union. A world governed just by private property completely would be a space without innovation. See, well, fortunately, there's nothing to see except the future in the United States right now. It's this balance that produces innovation. But a rhetoric to support balance doesn't exist. Now, this is why it doesn't exist. It's because you have been outside of the debate. The lawyers redefine this as a debate about property and theft, and your voice is silent in this debate. No one has framed this, no one credibly, no one like you has framed this as a debate about innovation and creativity. No one has translated the values embedded in your architecture of end-to-end into terms that the policymakers have to confront. They have reframed this as a debate about theft and property because that's to the benefit of those who fund most of their campaigns. This is the character of this debate. This debate needs you. Now, you are this pathetic, apolitical bunch, brilliant, no doubt, but apolitical because you have no respect for the politicians or many of us, lawyers. You, with good reason, have no respect for the politicians or many of us, the lawyers. But if you sit around and leave us with the power to control what this future will be, we will make this future into something very different from what you originally crafted. You have to teach the policy that's built into this code. You have to teach this law that's built into this code. You have to save this code from us. You haven't done this so far. I fling myself across the globe to speak to a bunch of network architects because network architecture is the most important lesson that we've not yet learned. And until this group, people like you, recognize what is threatened here, as people like me impose rules that force you to change this network, until you respond to that, the promise of this network, with the equal opportunity of Ireland contributing with South Africa, contributing with the United States, the promise of that network will not be realized. Instead, this network will appear much like the networks we have seen in the past, a place where an increasingly concentrated few get to pick the future of innovation for the many. That's what you inverted, and that's what we are reestablishing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Larry. I'm definitely happy that you're on our side. I also would like to see that you instill this message to your students that we can create a generation which defends freedom and liberty against the entrenched forces. In fact, concentrate the few riches is nothing new. If we think of the mill, which is not far from the university here, well, a couple of centuries ago, the Lord wanted to be the only one who had a mill where you could grind your grain, because it was a source of revenue. When the printing press was invented in Gutenberg's days, the church said, "This is mine," because this is a tool which could lead to heresy. And in fact, if we now look at the 20th century or the 21st century and the issues you bring up, it's again a matter of fact that the established people who have control of some riches want to keep them as long as possible. But I think the positive side of the message and of your effort is that if one looks at history, it's like water building up behind a dam, and in the end, progress will prevail. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
If there are a couple of questions, please, it is 3:45. We have our coffee break we want to take, and then we would reconvene, I think, a little bit later, around 4:15. If there's any questions for any of the speakers. Please. Yeah, I don't think so. So here's most colorful example of why I don't think that's going to happen. In an expression of vanity, I set up a Morpheus server in my Stanford network. Not to trade Britney Spears songs, but to put lectures of mine up other people could take. On a Saturday night, I got a frantic message on my home answering machine saying that illegal activity was going on my node, and that the network security police had to come in and unplug my computer. So Monday I went to work and I said, well, what was the problem? What was going on in the node? And they said, well, there was a Morpheus server on your node. And I said, you know, it's still allowed in the United States for somebody to voluntarily make their content available to other people. This is a permitted use of technology. But the network security people had been so brainwashed by the lawyers of the university to say, we have got to comply with this war to make sure that our services aren't being used in any way inconsistent with the command that there be no theft. Now, there might be universities that resist, might be. I don't really see how that's possible, though, given that the universities depend so much upon government money, and governments are very much in the business of advancing these interests. So if there were a significant resistance, I think that would be great. But the problem is, even if it were a significant resistance, the effect of the change on freedom and the ability for innovation to occur, not just for non-commercial, but also commercial development. You know, my story is not about how we've got to be tree huggers in love with, you know, sort of environmentalism and left ideas. This is also about how the next Microsoft or the next Netscape has an opportunity to innovate. Unless there's a substantial space where that can occur free of this type of control, I think that the dark story that I tried to tell will happen. Do we have any other questions? Please.
So there's two parts to what you said. The first part is the need to find a technology to deal with cell phones. The first part is the need to balance what the intellectual property problem is, right? So you're right that intellectual property owners, of course, can choose what to do with their intellectual property. And I'm wildly in favor of intellectual property, right? I'm not against copyright. In many contexts, but not in the software and business method patent area, I'm not against patents. I think patents are very important to innovation. But what lawyers have always recognized about these intellectual property rights is they are never absolute. They have never been as extreme in the context of copyright as they are right now. They've always been restricted and balanced. And my only point is, in the context of copyright, they have become so expansive that they do much more than just give the romantic author the power to pick and choose what happens to his or her work. They've given the power back to the publishers to control what the future of creativity in a certain space is going to be. And that's the only thing I'm complaining about. Not copyright alone, but the way in which copyright can be abused. Now, so the question is, what's a way to deal with this abuse? I think in certain contexts, a compulsory license makes a lot of sense to deal with this problem of transition. Right? In the context of online music, I think that's a first example. The problem with online music is that we have really two problems that are being thought of as one. There's a ton of music out there that's unprotected, right? CDs that are not protected in any form. With this unprotected music, you can take your content and make it available to your 10,000 best friends. That's a legitimate concern for content owners. The problem going forward, though, won't be unprotected content. The problem going forward will be content that is too perfectly protected, because obviously encryption technologies will be used to protect this content, and the issue we need to worry about there is whether there's adequate fair use protected in those technologies. The problem that's happening right now is that these problems, two separate problems, are being thought of as one. And I think if we separate them and we say, with respect to existing content, unprotected content that's already produced, there's a compulsory license right. So that instead of monitoring every single transaction, what network providers or companies like Netscape, companies like Napster could do is simply take a random sample of the transfers that are occurring on their network and then pay according to the random sample and charge a flat fee to people accessing their network. That would guarantee that content owners got compensated for that content. It would also make it possible for lots of people to become competitors, right? Because they could, there'd be 10 Napsters out there, all trying to facilitate the exchange of this content. But that would only be for existing content. Content going forward would be encrypted. That's just the future. There's no way to escape this. But in my view, you should only permit that encrypted content to escape the compulsory license if it permits adequate fair use built into its technology. So I think you're right. That is an adequate solution in a narrow context. But in the United States, again, right now, if you mention compulsory license, it's thought of as a violation of the fundamental property right, requiring what's called a takings adjudication, meaning you've got to compensate for this, quote, taking of your property. And that, I think, is just the consequence of this overly expansive conception of intellectual property, which thinks of it in this crude sense as just normal property, right? But the reality is, right, it's never been thought of as normal property. In the very same Constitution that says, if the government takes my property, it must pay me compensation, the Constitution also says, if the government gives me a copyright, it must, after a, quote, limited time, take it back and give it to the public. Right? It's a fundamentally different idea, and the problem is that people like Valenti have succeeded in changing the rhetoric such that people don't think of it in a different way.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. Please, Stanislav.
It's a great question. So standardization turns out to be a very hard problem to solve for these public open networks. Right? Everybody developing standard faces a common dilemma. On the one hand, if you take your standard, like CERN, and you open it up to the public, throw it into the public domain, as CERN did with TCP/IP, then the danger is somebody will come in and embrace and extend that standard in a way that defeats its underlying purpose. Right? That's the problem with the public domain. TCP/IP avoided that problem because no one noticed, no commercial entity noticed it until it was so well entrenched in the existing infrastructure that it couldn't be corrupted. On the other hand, if you keep the standard yourself, a la Sun and Java, then everybody says, oh, sure, you're giving it away now and anybody can build on top of Java, but when everybody's building Java, then you're going to impose the Java tax. So we can't really trust you in the long term with the standard. And so this creates the problem of how do you facilitate standards which on the one hand can't be corrupted, and on the other hand convey enough confidence to other people that they can rely on that standard as always being open and available to them. And the fact is we have no simple solution to that problem. There's something which I'm involved with called the Creative Commons, which is trying to facilitate a conservancy, like a land conservancy, where people who are developing standards like this can donate the intellectual property because we'll continue to control the intellectual property. It can't be corrupted. But because we're a nonprofit, there's no way that we could ever tax people down the road for the deployment or use of this standard. So that might be one solution. Another solution pushed by Sun right now is that when there are patents, for example, that underlie a standard, those patents have to be licensed under a royalty-free basis. But of course, the possibility of that being agreed to by some of the most important patent holders, like IBM or Hewlett-Packard, might be slim. So that would be another solution, but the fact is there's no good solution here. And you can see the nature of the problem. We want standards everybody can build on in an open way. But we want them to be voluntarily created. Nobody wants a government to be in the business of building the next set of standards. And so there's no, under existing system, there's no system or ethic to support that without this danger of corruption.
Ladies and gentlemen, this will conclude what I hope will have been a thought-provoking session. And let us not forget for the apolitical bunch amongst us that if you're not interested in policy, policy is interested in you. Thank you.